Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be discussing the implications of a failed education system. In this week's TED Talk, a quote that really stood out to me was from journalist Thomas Friedman of the New York Times. The big breakthroughs happen when what is suddenly possible meets what is desperately necessary. I liked this quote because we know what's desperately necessary in education. Now we need to make those breakthroughs. And one of these big breakthroughs is online education. For me, this week's TED Talk really hit close to home. As we all know too well, in some parts of the world, education is not readily available. But what I found even more shocking, or what continues to shock me, is that even in places that education is accessible, that does not mean it's easily reached. Even more so, nowadays, having a higher education doesn't automatically guarantee you opportunities. We see time and time again college graduates graduating and not being able to find jobs. And as we advance into the 21st century, this can no longer be the norm. Education is a fundamental human right and needs to be available to everybody. Lifelong learning not only provides opportunities, but it expands minds and advocates innovation. What I found interesting in her discussion is lifelong learning does not only allow us to advance in our careers, but we can learn something just for the sake of learning because we want to. And by making education accessible to everyone, we may even see the next Steve Jobs or Albert Einstein from individuals whom without access to free online education may never have become great innovators otherwise. Additionally, by offering extensive online learning services for free around the globe, we're investing in what I believe is our greatest asset, which is our human capital. I find it's important to note, however, that although online learning may be the way of the future, existing educational systems we have throughout the world are failing to provide adequate educational services to its people. We find instances of this even in our own country. However, this week I have chosen Pakistan's current educational system, and that's what I'll be discussing for this presentation. Before I discuss Pakistan's current education system, I feel it's important to discuss what an education system is. Simply put, an education system comprises everything that goes into educating public school students at the federal, state, and community level. So it includes laws and policies, funding, resource allocation, administrative offices and facilities, human resources and staffing, and the basic supplies that we need in order to teach our children adequately. These are just a few of the things that comprise an education system, but they all fall under this umbrella of what makes an education system. Let's discuss now the education system in Pakistan. Unfortunately, we live in a world now where terrorism and extremism are an ever-present danger in our lives. And it's important to understand and address some of the roots of this radicalization and discontent. Pakistan has been at the center of the debate for many years. Pakistan, unfortunately, is a country that's gripped by poverty and corruption, and the Pakistani people have suffered violence and despair beyond any of our imaginations. And a key component to this is their ailing education system. Education is meant to evoke hope, but Pakistan continues to fail their children when it comes to education. And this failing system leads to the disenfranchisement and disengagement of many Pakistani children, which makes them susceptible and vulnerable to becoming radicalized. Problems impacting Pakistan's education system include poverty. It's difficult to learn when you are homeless and hungry. This week's reading noted that even in the U.S., 42% of our children live in low-income families, and education policies cannot continue to ignore their needs. Government policies are a problem. There's a lot of corruption when it comes to education. There's a lack of awareness in parents and students. There's lack of knowledge, opportunities. One of the biggest things is adequate facilities. A lot of facilities don't have electricity or running water, making them a hazardous place to learn. Overall, there's a very low teaching standard. Women awareness, there's a very big gender gap when it comes to educating women in Pakistan. Many parents are hesitant to send their daughters to school. Even a few years ago, Malala Yousafzai, she is the young woman, she was shot by the Taliban just for attending school. And the war on terror. Pakistan's engagement in war against terrorism also affects their education system. Militants often target schools, and several institutions are the target of many terrorist groups. The quality of education. Pakistan uses one instrument to measure their education quality at the national level, and it's a study called the Annual Status of Education Report. And the most recent report paints a pretty grim picture. Perhaps the most alarming statistic, in my opinion, is roughly half of 10-year-olds seem to demonstrate the competency expected of 6-year-olds. And the children who do manage to go to school do so against incredible odds. As I mentioned in the last slide, adequate facilities is a big problem in Pakistan. Last year's survey revealed that only 51% of all government primary schools didn't have working electricity, 36% didn't have drinking water on school premises, and 42% don't have working facilities. A quote that really stood out to me was, "Pakistan's fitful cycle of military and civilian rule has produced a national discourse in which there are disagreements about many things. But there has been one constant throughout. Pakistan's government and society deny a decent education to millions of children." What's even, in my opinion, sadder is even if Pakistan was miraculously able to get 25 million children into school buildings that were not a hazard to their lives, we would still be a long way from solving the country's huge education crisis. And a crisis it is. In the next couple of slides, I want to discuss some possible solutions and recommendations that have been proposed to better Pakistan's failing education system. And something that stood out was, even though it might not be possible for the government at the moment to implement a uniform education system in the country, they can start to implement a uniform curriculum. This is going to provide equal opportunity to the students of rural areas to compete with students of urban areas for jobs. Since the majority of Pakistan's population resides in rural areas and access to education is a major problem for them, they need to have a more balanced approach for formal and informal education. And government and non-government sectors should work together in order to promote education in these rural areas. And the federal government, it seems to be paying attention to vocational and technical training. However, they need to make the already existing vocational schools more efficient. In terms of recommendations, technical education should be made a part of secondary education. They need to have more technical skills built in, so things like carpentry, electrical, technical education. Provide those vocational jobs. They need to provide, possibly providing economic incentives to students may encourage parents to send their kids to school and help reduce dropout rates. The local government system needs to be helpful in promoting education and literacy, and corruption in education needs to stop. There needs to be an effective monitoring system put in place. And perhaps most importantly, back to adequate facilities. For any system to work, it's imperative that relevant structures are developed. An educational mindset needs to be changed or reset. Education needs to be valued and promoted by the government. In conclusion, so the reforms required in the education system of Pakistan cannot be done by the government alone. There needs to be a mix of public and private participation, as well as formal and non-formal education, to pull the majority of the country's population from illiteracy. Similarly, they need to make the youth of the country an asset, and I think to do so, attention should be paid to vocational and technical training in addition to secondary education. Thank you for listening, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.